just a boy from Kansas out to save the world from chronic disease. And I truly mean that. Nobody is in control of your health but you. I can't heal you. Your doctor can't heal you. You have to heal you. And it's all about having the education and empowerment to know what you need to be changing within yourself, within your life, to set your soul free and accomplish that best life that we all like to talk about. And I truly believe that the greatest medicine of all is to teach people how not to need it. I'm Brendan Vermeyer, the original Holistic Savage. Welcome to the Holistic Savage podcast. Yep. Welcome, Dr. Guy, to
Thank you.
The Holistic Savage podcast, where we like to discuss all things related to functional health, consisting of functional medicine, functional fitness, functional spirituality, and functional psychology. Love the shirt, my brother. So how are you doing today?
Representing. Right here.
I'm not, but it looks good on you.
You're not representing, yeah, but I got you. I'm good. I'm really good. It's great to be on the show and on the podcast, and thank you so much for having me. And excited for today.
Absolutely. The podcast is totally just like a passion project where, it gives me an excuse to like hang out with my friends and have cool conversations about all the cool stuff we do in our industry. So we've had a lot of amazing people on the show, and, certainly in 2019, we got connected where fun story. You were on stage giving a talk about the gut-brain connection while I was stuffing my face with some smoked salmon in the back of the room. I was like, who is this guy? I like this guy, and then now just Vibe Tribe ever since.
Yeah. I mean, we've been at 5 or 6 shows at this point together.
Yeah, just like everywhere we go, it's like, oh,
what's going on?
I look forward to the day that like all of us, we get Carrie and Tina and you and me, and like we get the squad.
Yeah.
And then we just take over as squad.
Yeah. So it's funny, Tina Moore and I go way back. She was actually one of my first mentors in regenerative medicine, almost 6 years ago at this point.
Oh, that's sick.
And then Carrie Jones and I, we did a podcast too. I love it. I love our group. Yeah,
we've got a tight circle. We just had Tina on the show. Not that long. We haven't released the episode yet, but it was awesome really? Recording. That'll be a sick one. So we just got our squad. So Dr. Guy, you are a naturopathic physician, correct?
Yes.
Very good. So I figured, we'll probably cover kind of a broad area of topics today, but I know one of the things we wanted to talk about was kind of the current state of the healthcare system, because obviously in today's world and with 75% of the workforce by 2025 is going to be made of the millennial generation. And I definitely find kind of the functional medicine movement is very much a millennial driven movement for the most part. But being a naturopathic physician, I'd love to hear you speak to kind of your observations on the state of things and where you feel like this is all going. We can just dive in, kind of see where this goes.
Yeah. So I'm not in love with the state of things currently, and I think that's why I go on stage and I speak, and that's why I spend generally quite a bit of time with each patient, is just the education of where we're at right now from where we need to be collectively, I think is pretty far off. I think the difficulty is that medicine has become such a pro-disease model rather than a preventative model. And in the pro-disease model, what I see is that there's just a cover-up Band-Aid solution all the time. And it's so prevalent with the allopathic mindset. And that's, by allopathy, I mean just general conventional Western mindset. And that's not bad when you're dealing with emergencies. But what I find is it's really bad when you're dealing with chronic disease, because chronic disease is multifactorial. There's multiple systems at play. And there is, that you mentioned functional spirituality. And I think that's a really important topic. I just came back from, I just did a 10-day meditation yoga retreat in the Bahamas, which that's sick. Changed my brain. Yeah. I feel unbelievable. And so, it's 2 weeks of the average rest of the average American gets 2 weeks off
Mhm.
a year.
Yeah.
Europeans, South Americans, they get something like 8 weeks is the average. So we're chronically overstressed. Our food supply is compromised significantly. Nutritionally, we're deficient in a bunch of stuff, and then they're just putting all this stuff into our food, and it's
Mhm.
kind of driving us crazy a little bit. So one of the specialties that I have is I talk about the microbiome. That's what I
Mhm.
lecture on, and so what we're seeing is that the microbiome is so prevalent in controlling all of the things, almost all the biology in the body. Um, it has a correlation, if not uh, a direct aspect of control. So, as naturopathic doctors, we've kind of been since the beginning of time saying like everything starts in the gut. Everything
Mhm.
starts in the gut, and that's what we're finding to be true now. And now the medicine's coming out, and we have a long way to go. But yeah, as far as like the general healthcare of and the general state of things, yeah, we're kind of living in a tough time right now. I think there's a huge pendulum swinging across the board, politically, spirituality,
Mhm.
um, you know, overall holistically, and a big mindset shift. And so, as you mentioned, millennials, I think they are really good at understanding the difficulties of what's come before them and able to shift away from that. And so, yeah, I hope it continues moving in the correct direction forward. But yeah, I
Mhm.
think yeah. What's your take on where we are right now?
It's a big thing, and I remember, when I was a little bit younger, because I am a young guy in this industry, and when I was kind of first breaking into it, I was probably maybe like a little bit more immature with my message of it, like, the system's broken, da 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 da. And one of my friends, Dr. Adam Miller, who we had on an episode in season one, and he's a medical doctor, MD, and like a dentist and like 50 other things. He's an impressive dude, but the way he was really describing it is kind of a um, identity crisis, and I was like, that's an interesting way to look at it, and probably a good way to put it. Because on the one hand, I just recently went to a medical doctor's office with my mom because I was there to advocate for her and help bridge that gap because patients, the average individual, the average client, the average patient, they have no idea what they need. They just don't know. Well, I need to lose weight, diet, and exercise. And it's like 70% of the American population is overweight or obese, and almost 50% of the American population is pre-diabetic or diabetic. And it's just you look at the disease statistics, and yeah, we are in a chronic disease epidemic, and certainly the technology we have with drugs and surgery never ceases to blow my mind, and the majority of the science that we know, gosh, I open my textbooks, and the amount of physiology, biochemistry that we know and have just mapped out step by step by step, it's mind blowing. And most of that really was discovered through funding from big pharma. So it's like, okay, well, you look at it that way, but like I just produced this super cool self healer guide to mold illness, and I cited 122 research papers in this thing, and it's like just all this evidence. And of course, you go to the medical doctor, and I think I have mold toxicity, and they don't believe you. That doesn't exist, even though like they use mycophenolic acid, a mycotoxin, pharmaceutically for organ transplant rejection surgery, and we've studied it for biological warfare. So my point being, yeah, when it comes to a lot of the functional alternative sciences, microbiome, and how microbes or any other functional topic plays into chronic disease, and it's like it's just largely ignored by conventional medicine. And I have seen some positive changes. I was pleased with the appointment that my mom experienced with her medical doctor. She was pretty receptive, but nonetheless, we have so far to go.
We have so
And
Yeah.
In the functional space, okay, a lot of patients feel failed by conventional healthcare. They're tired of going to a doctor and making their health complaints. And oh well, do you want something to make you feel better, SSRI or whatever it is? So then they turn to functional. But then in the functional space, it's hard to know what kind of practitioner you should look for because
Mm,
everybody's kind of working on something different.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, what do we do?
The difficulty with functional medicine too is that there's a certain aspect where we hold MDs to the highest standard of understanding the body, right? And
Mm,
then what I see consistently, and again, there are a lot of brilliant functional MDs out there. But what I see a lot of the time in my office is somebody comes in and they've had, you know, thousands of dollars worth of testing, which I don't think is necessary. Most of the time, usually it's much more simple than that. But these doctors will do a deep dive. They've done the IFM, the Institute of Functional Medicine courses, which is 8 weekends, and it's great. It's great information. But if they've never had true mentorship and understanding a functional way to look at the body, not just functional medicine, they are just running through an allopathic mindset, right?
mm,
So they're still
mhm,
like, okay, there is a problem somewhere. Let's, instead of giving a drug, now we're going to give a vitamin or we're going to give a mineral, right? And we're going to plug that in, and we're going to hope the whole system kind of like, it's like they're looking at like breaks in the physiology, and they're hoping that by adding a little bit of something where that break is, everything kind of repairs itself.
mhm,
Um, and again, that's not a multifactorial way to look at the body. It's not a systemic way to look at the body in a true holistic fashion. And in that way, I think oftentimes patients are led, that they've spent a ton of money, they've exhausted all their options, they don't know where to look, they don't know what to do, and then they're feeling kind of poor. So yeah, it's a tough way to navigate it unless you're really trained in knowing which practitioner to go to, or knowing what's wrong with you and where to look for the answers. I can't even imagine how potentially stressful it is for the patient to be like, where do I go? Who do I look for? What do I need? And doing it in a cost effective way. And then our insurance systems, they barely cover anything. So yeah, we're in a tough place, I
mhm,
think, in the world right now.
mhm.
So, I think
Absolutely.
all we can do is kind of do this kind of stuff and educate as many people as possible. I think stuff like this is the way to create change, and hopefully we reach a bunch of people, and teach them what to look for, what to think about in terms of their own health. And
Mhm.
yeah,
Absolutely. I'm really happy to hear you say that because I find myself saying that all the time where I find, I mean, I'm pretty well exposed, within this industry, and I do still see just too much reactionary. I feel that functional medicine is still a little bit too reactive, not
yeah,
proactive enough, little still too. And you literally said that, and I find myself saying that all the time, where it's like, okay, conventional medicine, like run whatever conventional diagnostic testing, diagnose the disease. Like, oh, you have irritable bowel disease. We treat with anti inflammatory steroids. We don't look for what caused the
right,
inflammatory disorder. But then, like, okay, functional medicine, all right, so we're going to do, you know, first off, they charge you an arm and a leg. We're going to do thousands of dollars of tests. It's hard to get into the office. And then it just kind of feels like, okay, well, instead of running conventional tests, we're going to run functional tests. Instead of giving pharmaceuticals, we're going to give pharmaceuticals and supplements. And it's still just like throwing pills at a piece of
yeah,
paper, uh,
yeah,
and it's like, well, that's not holistic, that's not functional. and
yeah,
and so it's like we need to make functional medicine more functional, and that's where, like you said, the greatest medicine of all is teach people how not to need it. And so this is
yeah,
where obviously we're all kind of rallying together.
yeah,
But yeah, we have to be, more like, for example, I was just recording a module for my course, and it's kind of like the difference, the paradigm shift of seeking out healing opportunities versus looking for disease. And the example I gave in the recording was talking about, Clostridia overgrowth, where, okay, well, there are ways of assessing Clostridia overgrowth. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have an acute Clostridia infection that's, causing pseudomembranous colitis and you're, shitting blood or something. But it's
Mhm.
like, well, let's maybe not wait for it to become that. And, if we see evidence that you have an overgrowth of a potentially pathogenic, bug, and there's clinical correlation where you have symptoms and health complaints that we can connect back to that, why don't we do something proactive, like take some spore biotics or da 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 da
Mhm.
da. So totally agree with you, and it's great to, like-minded people. So then, let's go and run with that, where
Yeah.
you mentioned the microbiome.
Yeah.
So wasn't it Hippocrates like 1,000 years ago that said all disease begins in the gut?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
something about that.
Yeah. So I'm finding that's the case. And so I specialize. So now, because I speak for microbiome labs,
Mhm.
there's a lot of people that are hearing about me, and then they're coming in for pretty complicated gut stuff.
Mhm.
I'm finding an interesting correlation. So let's talk about it here, because I think a lot of people are suffering from it, and I don't think it's being talked about as much. And that is the direct correlation between anxiety and gut issues. What I see above most other disease states is that when people have gut stuff, they become hypochondriac is the wrong label, but it's probably the closest way I can, right? They're so concerned about their health state, and they're living on levels of anxiety, and for some reason it's really hard to calm their mind down a little bit. And so let's talk about the physiology of that a little bit, because
Mhm.
I think it's really interesting. So a lot of people might be diagnosed with SIBO. I think SIBO's, really prevalent in society now. At least I see it all the time. Patients are coming in, they're like, "I'm diagnosed with SIBO. I'm diagnosed with SIBO. I'm diagnosed with SIBO." Um, a lot of the times it's an easier fix than they think it is,
Mhm.
and then some of the time it's a really difficult fix. And I think the difference is that sometimes the mechanism of their specific SIBO is a little bit beyond our understanding of what all of the different microbes in their specific gut are doing.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm not necessarily for testing the microbiome.
Mhm.
I don't know how you feel about it. I know Microbiome Labs did just push their first stool test analysis, so I'm really excited to see how that's changing between the other models. But generally, what I find is I run, a microbiome from, there's tons of different functional medicine companies out there. I'll run a microbiome stool analysis. I'll get this entire report back, and then it's like, okay, well, I don't know, how does that change now based on what I know what to do,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So I can go after specific bacteria, but we don't know enough yet about like what all the different bacteria are doing collectively. We have a general understanding that like there are groups of bacteria, and that in those groups, if they're elevated, they're more prevalent in these disease states. So then you correlate the symptoms of the patient with what you're kind of seeing in the stool analysis, and it's confirmatory mainly, right? But then what's the major change, right? And so
Mhm.
I just go back to what I do with everybody anyway, to, you know, um, I guess like optimize their gut microbiome from what I know already. So that stool analysis doesn't really, it's just it's a it's a $400 confirmatory test at that point,
Right.
or non-confirmatory. But then still, if it's not confirmatory, I still know that they're having gut issues. So it's like, okay, well, unless there's pathogens that are so visible within that stool analysis, that's really that's really where the majority of the situation, if like I'm like, okay, you have an actual infection or a parasite, now we kind of have to go after it.
Mhm.
So from a testing perspective, I think a lot of patients are like, great, I want to test my stool, but that's not, I don't think that's as big of a bang for their butt. It's like more of an
Mhm.
understanding of like, what are people experiencing from their gut, and then what are we going to do about it, right?
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about the microbiome. So the microbiome, for those people who are listening, If you're a little unfamiliar, it's basically a collection of microbes or gut or bacteria within your gut. And you have a microbiome in every single sort of organ cavity in the body. So you have a bladder microbiome, you have a vaginal microbiome, you have an oral microbiome, you have your gut microbiome, right? So you have you have a different microbiome for every single type of cavity or opening where bacteria live and collect, and then those bacteria have very specific physiological functions, so that they all do a very specific thing, usually very symbiotic, meaning in combination or um, beneficial for the body, right? So we work together as two different systems collectively for the same purpose of creating health. What happens is we take in pesticides, chemicals, toxins, antibiotics, and we alter our microbiome from a healthy state if we were born vaginally and breastfed with like a healthy supply, right, to
Hmm.
initially inoculate a healthy microbiome. If we are already born in a healthy state, we then have all this advent of like high sugar, corn syrup, everything that we were living in, and then all this toxicity as well. And then that alters the microbiome, and it starts to degrade certain aspects within the gut specifically, and then our microbiome shifts from a healthy state to a disease state, right? For as a general basis.
Hmm.
So then what happens is we have the onset of chronic disease, usually because inflammation starts there and then spreads to the rest of the body. So we could, I don't know if you want to get into LPS toxicity and metabolic endotoxemia. You do. You want to get
Let's
into
do
all
it. Yeah, let's do it.
all right.
This is a rabbit hole kind of podcast.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. So bacteria have on the outer layer of the bacteria on the cell membrane, they have something that's called LPS. Okay, and so LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide. And so as bacteria, because you have trillions of bacteria in your gut, as they die, they release this LPS out of the into the lumen. So basically into the free flowing space in the colon, where if you eat, everything pretty much goes into the lumen, right? And so I'm explaining that poorly. So basically, the whole of the gut, outside, like, help me out. How do I explain the lumen?
Yeah, so it's like, we've got all the bugs and critters, and we've got our mucosal barrier, and then the actual the analogy I always use when I'm teaching my students is like we have the castle, and we've got the inside of the castle where everybody's living, and then there's like the moat that goes around the castle. So that's like our mucosal barrier, that
Right.
chemical
That's good.
defense line. So then it's like you've got all these invaders. So let's say all the bacteria and the LPS, and it's like, well, they got to make it past that mucosal barrier, and then they have to get over the castle wall. But that happens, right, where we get the breakdown of the mucosal barrier, we get the degradation and destruction of our epithelial tissue, that and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, yeah, shit's getting across into the bloodstream
Yeah.
systemically.
That's a great analogy. So as you're eating food, right? So that will break down, and then you have probably a better, like a good on top of that, a good analogy is like you probably have like these bridges of
Mhm,
safety to allow stuff into the castle and to keep the bad stuff out.
mhm,
So that moat, that castle wall starts to degrade. And then what happens is you have this LPS, which will start to permeate or enter into the castle or your body without the proper protection or without the right binding. And then what that does is it creates a massive innate inflammation within the body. And then that creates a lot of generalized inflammation. So what I explain to patients is their chronic disease can always be traced back to one of the major causes, which is LPS or metabolic endotoxemia, which means that there is this toxin that's invading the body and then creating this overall generalized inflammation. And then depending on how their body responds to that, is where they experience the problem.
Mhm.
So whether that goes into joints to create arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, or it shifts their immune response internally so that they then become autoimmune, or it changes the neurochemistry so that things like mentioned before, like anxiety, all that stuff, the way that their nerves are processing, or it affects their blood-brain barrier, which then creates a whole sort of neurokinetic and neuroinflammatory cascade. So depending on how their body reacts to that inflammation dictates how they're going to experience disease
Mhm.
and what disease state we're going to label as this is the major disease that you're experiencing, patient A. And so then the conventional world is going to do, okay, so we know that it is a autoimmune disease. So we're going to give you things to regulate your immune system rather than treating the cause of it as like, so good. I like this castle analogy. So let's run with this for a little bit. So, um, instead of saying, okay, we need to fortify our walls a little bit better, so we stop getting this attack all the time from this LPS. We're just going to change the way we're working internally, and so the entire time you're never getting to the cause of the problem. And I think that's why patients are so frustrated, and it's not the allopathic doctor's fault because that's how they've been trained,
Yeah.
right? They've
Yeah.
been indoctrinated into this incredibly overpowering, mental, brutal. I have a family of doctors, and they're brilliant, right? Like they excel incredibly well at exams, and they're kind of doing all the things that they've always been told, and this is all the literature states, right? And so then they get into this incredibly rigorous mind-bending program,
Mhm.
and then they come out and they have a certain amount of ego usually because they've been told that you've done all of the hardest work probably in the world out of most professions. This is the way things are.
Mhm.
And and it's very difficult at that point to undo a little bit of that training and start digging into, well, why is that the way things are. So as we know more about the microbiome, as we understand the causative nature of chronic disease, as we understand the role that nutrition and diet and lifestyle have a play with the factors that cause chronic disease, then we can start changing it. Which again is why I don't run thousands of dollars worth of testing, because a lot
Yeah.
of the time it's like I just sit there for 90 minutes and I run through all the questions that I have with a patient and they tell me everything. And then it's like, okay, well, we know that these fundamental systems like your sleep, your eating, your drinking, your exercise, all of these systems are a little bit off. Or so
Mhm.
one of the systems is off significantly and it's altering the other systems. And then you've had an advent of these toxins and these glyphosates, and then your
Mhm.
mucosa or your castle wall is not strong anymore. And so you're allowing this disease state to kind of permeate into the body. Let's correct that stuff and then restore some of the basic systems of the body. And, people feel right as rain usually.
Absolutely.
So I think as brilliant as medicine has gotten, we've also ignored our own capability of healing.
Yeah.
So much so that, pharmacology takes over physiology. That's always how I explain it to my patient. When you start taking a pharmaceutical, you're taking over the physiology of the body. You're
Mhm.
not allowing the body to repair its own process.
Mhm.
And usually it's a cover up to what's really happening. So then another symptom comes on as a warning sign of like, okay, well, you've changed this physiology, so we can't show you the symptom anymore. It's like a crying child, right? Like you're not feeding the baby. Like you might be doing all this stuff, the baby's still crying. You might put a pacifier in, but it's going to find other ways to tell you it's hungry.
Right.
So that's kind of, yeah, right? So
Yeah.
so as generalized chronic disease, as generalized gut health, as the microbiome is concerned, the the basic and fundamental reason is that you have this LPS leaving the gut microbiome every time you eat, and then that creates this internal innate inflammatory cascade and this internal sepsis situation, internal mini sepsis.
Yeah, yeah,
And
totally
then
put it.
that internal sepsis is creating this immune reaction. And then depending on how that immune system is happening, then you have inflammation, because inflammation is the direct result of an overactive immune system. And then you have pain. Inflammation results in pain. So I forgot who it was. I actually think it was the founder of chiropractic. I don't know if it was, I think it was D.D. Palmer, actually, who initially said that inflammation is the primary cause of all chronic disease.
Hmm.
So, and that's true. I think
Yeah.
that's very true. And I think we now understand the mechanism of how that is. And I think we can just hope that this permeates into our culture a little bit and people understand, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, we're getting there, and we're covering a lot of good things because certainly again Hippocrates nailed it a long time ago, and it is what it is. Where humans with our monkey minds, we think we're very smart, and so then it's like, oh, we can, it's almost like pharmaceuticals are kind of the ultimate biohack. Like, oh, we make this
that
synthetic substance that just directly alters our, and it's the ultimate display of instant gratification, and now big pharma kind
uh,
of runs the world. And but backing up to, like, totally agree with you on the stool testing. I was glad to hear you say that, because certainly that's something I feel strongly about is stool testing. And that's kind of not, I don't know, I don't want to, it's not like I'm picking on anything or anybody in our industry, but obviously it's like, well, it's our goal to make the industry better and more efficient. And so it's like new tests come out every single day, but that's exactly what I'm seeing, the nuances of stool testing, where it's like, all right, well, back up. Like, our understanding of the microbiome is in its infancy.
infancy.
We have so much to learn. And so the problem with these kind of diagnostic stool tests, especially with the fancy DNA PCR technology, where it's like, oh, we can measure the DNA of all these different strains, but it's like, yeah, but there's no standard model of what a microbiome should look like. And everybody has a totally different microbiome. And we don't fully understand all of the mechanisms of, like, there are some very well established principles of, greater microbial diversity is better, correlated with better health. Okay, well, that's pretty well established. But when we get down to the species level of, this test is saying, well, you have high levels of this bug and low levels of this bug. It's like, what does that mean for the patient? What does that mean for the client? We don't know.
We don't know.
So that's why, like me, I've really gotten
We know collectively that there are
yeah,
groups of those bacteria that are correlated again in those specific disease models,
yeah,
right? Like we know, like you want a high level of Akkermansia, basically,
hmm,
right?
yeah,
As an example, overall, because that's a very protective bacteria, and if you
hmm,
see low levels, then it's a problem. So there are nuances, but across the board, you're right. Like we don't know all the different strains in combination with other strains yet, and then
right,
so there are thousands of strains and species, and like how what are they doing individualistically in the patient in quantity, and how is the patient's entire organism, basically, because it's an organism, right? It's like this massive organism, and we just learned about it. I mean,
hmm,
2010 was the end of the microbiome project, right?
hmm,
So
yeah.
like we're 10 years out of like just starting to be like, oh my god, we missed this massive controlling entity in the body that has so many physiological like implications. Like we're just penetrating into like the understanding of the microbiome. So yeah,
Yeah,
go on.
you're no, you're exactly right. We have a very complex ecosystem within us, on us. We have more bacterial cells in us and on us than we have human cells. And that's where, with all my clients, I always tell them from day one, like, hey, gut health is not a protocol; it's a lifestyle, and it's
Yeah.
a lifestyle of gardening. And I think, again, kind of some of the maybe faulty practices in the functional medicine world of starting to try to treat specific strains, or chasing the bug. And it's like, well, look, I mean, every time you run that stool test, it's kind of like every time you go fishing, you cast your line, you're going to reel something else. So this time it's a minnow, this time it's a shark, this time it's a stingray, this time you didn't catch anything at all. And it's like, okay, but what does that mean clinically? And so that's why I've gotten away from stool testing. I'm really big on organic acids and blood chemistry, because it's like, I don't need to know every single little species. I need to know the overall microbial load and be able to see how that's affecting your physiology. If you like, why are your neutrophils not elevated? Why are your white blood cells low?
Okay.
So yeah, it's nuanced, and that's where we don't always need a test to be able to really kind of coach up like good gardening practices, right? And now I am very excited for microbiomes. I already did mine, and I'm waiting for the results. And I looked at a sample report, and it definitely looks, So I guess we'll see how that
Yeah.
plays out. But
Yeah.
tell us about what are some good gardening strategies for a healthy microbiome,
Okay.
Doctor Guy. You're
Um,
an expert gardener.
yeah, yeah. Try to be. It's tough. It's tough to, it's tough for me individually to really recognize that the majority of foods you can't do, right?
Yeah.
Um, but this is what I tell all my patients, because they come in with tons of food sensitivities, and I go, once we create that perfect castle wall again,
Mhm.
you should be able to eat the majority of foods as long as they're organic, right? As long as you're not putting these stuff that's going to break down that wall,
Right.
you should be able to eat almost everything. I mean, there could be specific things that you might just never be able to eat again, and that might be just the way your gut microbiome from the day you were born. Maybe it was you had some antibiotic when you were 6 months old and it changed
Yeah.
that castle wall permanently. And now you can't do, things like lactose and dairy and stuff like that, right? Or
Totally.
in worse situations like eggs, or, right, like
Yeah.
beans or legumes or whatever. So, um, as long as, but there's so, when you go out to eat, the stuff that's put into the majority of the food is toxic.
Yeah.
So, it's tough even when you go out to restaurants and you think it's clean food, it's not usually. No, not many restaurants are doing organic, and then the rest of the country outside of places like LA, New York, and Chicago, it's much more, and Portland or Seattle or something, it's much more difficult to get real true quality food.
Mhm.
So, it's easier in bigger cities. It's way more difficult in smaller cities, but there are tons of options. And so, it comes down to the necessity for me. Usually, if people are suffering with symptoms, they understand the need to change. And I think that's the difficulty, is that that's important, but it also comes from general people who are in good health also need to learn that there's a shift that needs to happen.
Mhm.
So, to answer, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but to answer some basic stuff, I'm a big fan of time restricted eating. Um, I really like it. I really like doing like the 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. protocol.
Mhm.
So, and the reason I like that is because of that LPS toxicity. So, when you eat, your bacteria turn over, meaning that they replicate, they recycle, they grow new bacteria. And so, out of that recycling of bacteria, you get more LPS into the lumen of the gut, which creates that inflammatory problematic issue. When you're fasting for 16 hours a day, your body is able to start putting all of its energy into the rest of the body, rather than to like this attacking the moat and castle wall scenario, right? Like, you have more resources to go around the body and correct the physiology of other areas that might need help. So the body's able to heal and do its healing properly, especially, if you're getting a good amount of sleep in, that healing restoration, without that onset of like all this inflammation and like the reactionary cause of the body, fixing what you're basically putting into it, it's able to come in and heal the rest of the body. So I think it's really incredible. Time restricted eating, I'm a big fan of. Um, I'm a big fan of keto in the short term.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of people have questions on keto and if it's beneficial or not. I don't think it's a good lifestyle. I think it's a good therapeutic diet.
Hmm.
Just based on the literature, what I've been talking with patients about, I think that living in keto for 3 to 6 months is amazing. I think it changes a lot of the inflammatory pictures in the body. I think you burn a lot of the inflammation. I mean, fat is incredibly inflammatory. And what I've seen personally is like, so I was 208 pounds. I'm like 185 now. This is over the course of the last couple of years. I've just been like living a better lifestyle and cutting down on. And what I noticed in my body is it's incredible. Just 20 pounds of fat is insane for creating inflammation, anxiety, that kind of picture. And reducing that, I feel more limber. I'm sleeping better. I'm feeling better. I have better relationships. And that's kind of what I tell my patients. Even just
Hmm.
15 pounds of fat, so many patients, they don't think that's really problematic. If they can get that off, they're going to notice a huge difference. And in time restricted eating is one of a great way to reduce or eliminate excess fat in the body,
Hmm.
in my opinion, and keto. So if they want to do keto for 3 to 6 months and then move on to like a time restricted eating, I really support that. And then usually I give them a whole host of stuff to take for the gut. Make sure they're eating a balanced diet. Make sure they're not eating a lot of inflammatory grains. Um, the five major foods: corn, soy, dairy, sugar, and what's the last one?
Grains.
Grains, yeah. If they avoid those foods, at least in the interim, I usually do some sort of food sensitivity test because I
Mhm.
want to see how their body's reacting. I take them off those foods in the beginning. Um, and then I give them a whole host of products to kind of restore that castle wall. So anything from Megaspore probiotics to a lot of the microbiome products I use. Depending on what's going on. And then I'll use a lot of herbals for restoring the mucosal degradation. I use DGL. I love
Mhm.
DGL. DGL is incredible. Aloe, right? And then downstream, like things like turmeric, bioavailable turmeric, if there's a
Mhm.
huge inflammatory cascade. But really, it's about restoring the mucosa and then changing and then so I use nystatin. That is a pharmaceutical that I like.
Mhm.
Manuka honey or garlic or aloe or allicin, depending on what's going on. So, it's complicated because patients hear about this and I want to be able to be like, oh, just do these few things, but it's so individualized to what they're
Yeah.
experiencing and what the problem is. And so, one of the things that we didn't talk about, I don't know if you want to go into it,
Yeah.
is SIBO.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do it.
You want to talk about SIBO a little bit?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay. So what I'm seeing with SIBO, and I don't know how much you're seeing this. I don't know how much other doctors are seeing this. I've been involved in a lot of the SIBO seminars. Um, at residency, they were doing a ton of SIBO stuff. I wasn't involved with them at that point, but all of the major SIBO players, at least in the naturopathic field, I've been following and kind of understanding what they've been talking about. And I talked to Kieran a lot about this, and he kind of mentioned this at the microbiome symposium. He touched on it a little bit, and that is SIBO's being diagnosed a little too soon before we understand the problem. And this is what I mean. A lot of times patients will drink water and they'll instantly be bloated. That's a huge symptom that I hear all the time. I drink water, I get bloated. Or I have a little bit of food and instantly I get bloated. Well, that technically cannot be SIBO, right? And that's the majority of the patients coming in. It's rare that you hear a patient saying, it's not rare. I mean, it happens too, but it's more rare that I'm finding, at least myself clinically, is that patients they're coming in and they're not saying, okay, about 45 minutes after I eat, then I get bloated and distended for the day.
Mhm.
That's more class, or even an hour later, right? So the food has to come into the stomach, it has to be metabolized, digested, it has to go into the colon, the small intestine, and then the bacteria need to eat on it, and then the byproduct of the bacteria eating the food is gas.
Mhm.
So when you have, so SIBO, for those people who don't know, is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So that means that in the small intestine, you have this bacteria overgrowth and creates this massive amount of bloating because too much bacteria, too much improper bacteria is eating this food, and then its byproduct is gas. And then there's a couple different types of gases, and depending on those gases, kind of clinically tells us which type of bacteria, because you can't test for strains of bacteria in the small intestine. So stool analysis only tests in the large intestine, or usually mostly just the rectum. So you don't really know. So then you do a breath test, and it'll
Mhm.
tell you the type of gas that you're secreting. And then that gas again will tell us this, more likely, these are the type of strains. And we know that based on the gas that they're secreting, we know kind of how to kill them or reduce their numbers a little bit so that the system becomes a little bit more. So in a general SIBO model, that's great, right? Because
Mhm.
we're like, okay, if you are having bloating and issues 45 minutes to 2 hours after you eat, do these kind of things. The conventional model is to give them rifaximin,
Mhm.
usually, which is an antibiotic for the small intestine, and then that'll kill all the bacteria. But what's happening is that patients, at least what I'm seeing, is that there's two things happening. They are incredibly anxious, that we touched upon originally. They're incredibly anxious, and then they're getting bloating upon the instant that they put food in their body. And that technically cannot be a SIBO. That has to be an issue with the stomach and potentially the gallbladder. So you have this delicate anatomical area of the body where you have the stomach duct, or the pyloric sphincter comes into the top of the what's called the duodenum, which is the canal, and all of these things kind of like enter into that same area. So you
Mhm.
have the pancreatic ducts, which release all your pancreatic, or people take digestive enzymes. The pancreas releases these digestive enzymes into the same area where the gallbladder will release its bile, and then you have this food that's been um, acidifying in the stomach that permeates down. And so in this very small canal, you have like three or four things coming together, and that, if that system then becomes problematic, you're having almost an instant reaction to the ingestion of food or
Mhm.
water. I find that that's much more difficult to treat. I find it really problematic because uh, there is a whole system that goes into play. So birth control, for instance, has a big indication with bile.
Mhm.
And bile is an antimicrobial,
Yeah.
and a fat emulsification system. So it helps you break down fat and absorb fat, and it also will kill poor bacteria. And so if you start to change your gallbladder issue, that starts to, I think there's two systems that are happening. I think you're having a hydrochloric acid or a fat, or an acidification issue, which then creates a different type of alkalinity within that area, which changes, I think, what's happening with the microbiome. Then you have potentially a problem with the gallbladder and the release of bile, and then maybe even a digestive enzyme issue so that food isn't being digested properly. All of those things are creating a very poor system for regulation within the top of the colon. It's called
Mhm.
the proximal bowel. So that's really the issue that I've been seeing clinically a lot. I don't see it being talked about too
Mhm.
often.
Yeah.
Um, one of Usually with those patients, I'm trying to get them off pharmaceuticals. I find that a lot of those patients are on pharmaceuticals. When I can get them off pharmaceuticals, they seem to do better. And then I really need to restore bile flow. Things like ox bile are great.
Mhm.
I give them a lot of cholagogues or liver movers. Um, things like dandelion, psyllium husk is really good for continuing that bile flow because it binds fiber, that kind of stuff. Like, so you want to focus on, you know, uh, helping the liver and the gallbladder. And then a lot of times I give them bitters because that'll increase the hydrochloric acid system because most patients think that they're too acidic. I find that they're either way too acidic or not enough acidic.
Hmm.
The symptoms look the same.
Yeah.
So if they're not enough acidic, then we give them bitters, and then that seems to regulate their hydrochloric acid system a lot better. It closes oftentimes that lower esophageal sphincter, which causes heartburn when that sphincter isn't working well enough. Most people are not even talking about the pyloric sphincter, even in our world.
Hmm.
I'm finding that that's very problematic in a lot of patients. I think that needs to be discussed a little bit more. And then you have this, like, so you have this acid system, and then you give them digestive enzymes potentially, and trying to correct that issue. Um, so I talked to a very intelligent SIBO doctor, and what she was doing, which was interesting, is she was testing people. She was sending all her patients to do the Heidelberg test that tests your acid system in the gut.
Hmm.
And what she was noticing was there was a bile backflow into the stomach. So instead of bile coming in and going down the duodenum, it's moving upwards and going through the pyloric sphincter back into the stomach,
Mm.
which is really interesting because that's going to change your hydrochloric acid system. And what that's showing us is that there is so much overgrowth of bacteria, and that basically the drain is. So for those people who are not anatomically aware of what I'm talking about, basically it's a drain. I'm talking about a major drain at the base of the stomach where all these systems kind of come together. And if that drain is clogged, you're going to get an overgrowth and a backflow of different things such as bile into the stomach, which is going to further permeate and create further problems. So this proximal bowel issue I am finding incredibly prevalent right now. I'm
Mhm.
finding a lot of my patients are coming in, and that's where the issues are. um, I don't know, are you talking about this, are you hearing about this?
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing all this up because I definitely do think SIBO can sometimes be overcomplicated, and a little IBS, a little SIBO, a little or a lot, bloating, distension, 45, 60, 70 minutes after you eat. That's usually relatively easy. Get some immunoglobulins, some binders, some probiotics, maybe a little biocidin. Like it's
Right.
usually or antibiotic
Yeah,
if
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention biocidin. I use biocidin
yeah,
really.
yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's usually easy enough, but no, I agree. And I think the bile thing is a big part of it, and so I'm very liberal with my use of ox bile and hydrochloric acid because, as you said, a lot of people that might have acid reflux and GERD, a lot of times they don't have enough stomach acid, and there's so much fatty liver and biliary stasis going on, and so with kind of bugs and detox sort of being my thing that I focus on the most. The bile flow is so crucial, right? Because as you said, it's a fat emulsifier, it's an antimicrobial. We conjugate all of our toxins into the bile, so focusing on that enterohepatic recirculation and the bile flow. And so, like, something I use a lot is phosphatidylcholine.
Yeah,
To
great.
think about like how many people are on statins, right, where they're cutting off their liver
Right,
production of cholesterol, and a lot of people are methylation imbalance, and phosphatidylcholine being one of the major products,
right,
methylation, which it's such a it's if you drink it, it's such a nasty thing because it's very viscous, and it's like, but that's what makes the bile viscous and able to flow through the tubes. So
right,
and look at how many people get their gallbladder removed,
right.
right? And those people are just like walking recurrent SIBO forever. So yeah, I
Absolutely.
totally agree, and I'm
Yeah,
glad you're bringing this
yeah,
up. And I think that's an area we need to, like, what's going on further down, I think, is relatively simple. I feel like we've got that pretty well figured out. But I totally agree, and I'm glad you're bringing it up with, because yeah, right in that duodenum, there's a lot going on. We
A
got
lot going on. Yeah.
the chyme coming in, and the
Right.
pancreatic dumping, and the bile flowing, so there's three major things that if any one of those is slightly dysfunctional or some combination of, and yeah, I think that can be a major problem.
Yeah, it's I think and I'm not hearing enough about it, unfortunately. It's not being talked about. I think it will. I think most people are gonna, because I think they're still so obsessed with like SIBO, right?
Yeah.
And so, but unless you're, but I don't hear it. So this is the difficulty, is I hear these doctors and they're like, oh, SIBO, just give them rifaximin and they're done. Like
Right.
right? It's an easy correlation. It's like, but yes, but they're not investigating further. They're not investigating into like, is your gallbladder, if it's out, how are you getting the bile, right? Because so bile, for those people who don't understand, it is still created in the liver.
Mhm.
So it's not that you don't have bile if you don't have your gallbladder. It's just the gallbladder is the storage of bile. And so what that means is when you eat fat, it releases this enzyme called CCK, and then that secretes, it kind of pumps out the bile into the intestine to help you when you eat fat. It's like a system, it's like a checkpoint system. So and then in the conventional world, it's like, oh, the gallbladder is an issue, take it out, right? Oh,
Right.
take that out, cut that out. It's like,
Right.
what are you? And then the gallbladder has this crazy microbiome too. The
Yeah.
gallbladder microbiome, which is incredibly important because again, it's another cavity in the body. So we got to stop chopping stuff out of people a little bit. People have to be a little bit more careful when they get stuff removed. And for those people who have had stuff removed, it's okay. But then you have to, maybe take an ox bile when you eat food
Uh-huh.
to give your body the bile it needs to emulsify the fat and then create that antimicrobial response. So, um, yeah, I think that's a decent explanation of like the proximal bowel issue. So I don't know if I hope that's enough information for those people watching to understand the complexity of the situation, but also understand that there's a lot you can do to
Totally.
help you feel better. And it's
Yeah.
not necessarily taking pharmaceuticals, which are overriding the system, but it's to help your natural organ systems use what they should be secreting properly that might have been um, improperly improperly functioning to create the right functionality so that you heal properly.
Yeah.
So it's a systemic issue. Chronic disease is a systemic issue arising from the gut, and when the organ systems function better collectively, that's when we restore health.
Mhm.
And we didn't even talk about hormones.
I
For
know.
another day,
Yeah.
probably. But
Yeah. Yeah.
hormones are 50% of what I do
Mhm.
because so important, right? I mean, they're messenger signals that create so many people have hormonal issues, right? Um, so majorly important, and then peptides also. We didn't even touch on peptides. So
Mhm.
uh, maybe we'll have another one. But
Yeah, I was gonna
peptides and
say,
hormones are also very cool. Worth a investigation into.
absolutely.
People reading about those or
It's
hearing
one
about.
of those, that's something I'm pretty keen, because definitely pretty much everybody in our industry really agrees. Like, yeah, the gut's pretty much a starting point. I mean,
Yeah,
the gut and microbiome, it's really ground zero. And so, like, when I'm training my practitioners, I always try to kind of create this sort of scale or hierarchy of intervention of, like, okay, if we're trying to improve the health of an organism, step one, the environment of the organism. Step two, the lifestyle and behavior of the organism. Step three, okay, then more supplementation, other types of therapeutic modalities. Step four, pharmaceuticals. Step five, surgery. And sort of like, all right, well, let's kind of go in order here. And so it's all the basic stuff, and people don't like hearing the basic stuff constantly, but it's like, yeah, I
yeah,
mean, you're a stressaholic, you're not
yeah,
sleeping, you're drinking tons of caffeine, you take ibuprofen, because it's like you look around, and unfortunately, And you touched on, fat and fat being very inflammatory and everything. It's like, well, yeah, all these people are like, people need to understand. It's like, okay, well, our phospholipid membrane that makes up the membrane of every single one of your 100 trillion cells in the body, and it's like the fat that you're ingesting, or food that you're ingesting, is going to dictate what type of fatty acids are in that cell membrane. And ultimately, when you have all these people that high sugar diet, high omega-6 diet, high fat diet, all these things, and it's like they are literally, well, they're overweight. And not just that, but all of that fat mass primarily is palmitic acid and arachidonic acid. And it's just like gunpowder,
Right,
waiting to go off. And then they all have, when you start looking into microbiome sciences, you very quickly start realizing, that it's like everything about the standard American lifestyle is a gut destroying one. And like you said, when we have all of this endotoxemia, we have all of this endotoxin driven inflammation, and we have all this gunpowder, just sitting in the cell membranes, poof,
right,
so it's
right,
it's funny how, like, we're getting into all the mechanisms and stuff, but when you just kind of look at the big picture, it's like, oh well, it's kind of a simple equation.
right,
And I think and that's where I think if the whole nation just went kind of keto, primal, paleo, like just eat real food from the earth,
right,
get lots of sleep,
right,
manage your stress,
right.
and then support the gut microbiome. But then, yeah, as far as hormones, it's kind of both. I definitely, and I'm sure you see it too, where it's like I do prefer to work on kind of gut and detox related work, but I also like to do that in conjunction with hormone modulation, because I mean, I there's a lot that we need to learn, but even the hormones alter immune function, and it's like, well, the microbiome really regulates immune function. So I definitely see, if we can kind of attack it from both angles, if we can do some hormone modulation and run that Dutch test, work on the improving the health microbiome, and doing our gardening strategies. Now, obviously, making sure that we're not losing sight of the big picture of environment and lifestyle, like that right there, that's like 90% of cases. And,
Yeah,
there's those 10% that are difficult and complicated, but for the rest of the 90%, it's actually relatively simple
yeah. It's
equation.
not that complicated.
Oh,
Yeah, and
uh,
instead of like doing crazy deep dives and spending thousands of dollars of tests, you can, yeah. Usually, I run a Dutch. I
yep,
run basic blood work.
yep,
Um, and my basic blood work is apparently extensive, but I think it's basic.
yeah, totally. Totally.
I'm like, we need all these tests, and people are like, that's a lot. I'm like, it's not that, but that gives every system of the like that. That's a true, right?
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
that,
so funny to me when like doctors will run like,
AMP, CBC,
yeah,
all
like
that.
4 tests. I'm like, what is that telling you? Like, that's just such a small snippet. But
Totally.
yeah, but I love blood work, and I do that often. And you're 100% right. Like when you put the major components together, the body does what it's meant to do, and that's to heal.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a stronger picture at play now, which is so important, and that is people are attempting to find happiness
Mhm.
right now, more prevalent in our society than ever before. I think as a collective, we, especially millennials, right? Like
Yeah.
we are, happiness is um, the major driver, I think, now
Mhm.
amongst people, right? Like people are not saving as much, they're eating out more, they're going out more, they're being more social. Um, so I think we're attempting to find happiness, and happiness is uh, such an important part of with of lifestyle.
Yeah.
If you have a proper lifestyle, you're gonna be happier. If you exercise more and you meditate, right, and you calm that monkey mind down, and you have some sort of spiritual practice, and you have a community of people, there's gonna be an achievement of happiness and calmness in the body, which is gonna further perpetuate more healing and more response. And I and so I was just traveling. Like I said, I did a 10-day meditation, and then I went to Colombia for 10 days after that. Um, did a really nice trip.
Yeah.
And what I find with the Colombian people is they're so much more calm.
Mm,
You know, they have this brilliant. First of all, they're not on their phones every 2 seconds. You never see them on their phones. They're not getting this like crazy dopamine electronic response all the time. They're not overworked. They're full of community. They're full of family. They're full of this love. Um, and they navigate through the world at such a less stress point.
mhm.
You don't ever hear them yelling, losing their minds, honking their horns, running to the next meeting, grabbing a quick burrito or burger,
Yeah.
right? Like you see a much more calm state of mind.
Right.
And what I notice is a much higher amount of happiness just as a general perspective between cultures. And I think as Americans, we're in a tough place. I
Yeah.
think Americans are in a tough place right now. I think we're politically torn. I think we are spiritually torn. I think we're isolated in a community. From each other. There's a big fear factor between people. I think
Mhm.
we're given all these toxins that make us anxious. We're given this lifestyle of perpetual work and no play.
Yeah.
We're separated from each other, and I think it's really important for us to come together. I think it's really important for us to take some of the more priority of what does happiness mean, and calm our brains down a little bit from a
Yeah.
meditative standpoint and finding a true practice that's supportive for us. I think it's really, really difficult to do that. I think it's incredibly difficult to find the time for you in this culture,
Mhm.
um, and I just hope we can get the word out. I don't know what it takes for people to move to that next step of self care and self love and evolution.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that's as much of a problem health wise as it is
Yeah.
all this physiology.
I could not agree more. I'm so glad you brought this up, and kind of a good way for us to sandwich this convo. And this is where functional spirituality, kind of the little term I coined, is to me I really look at it as like, well, functional medicine is amazing. Don't get me wrong. However, functional medicine is really just one quarter of what I call functional health, with the fitness, spirituality, psychology, and medicine. To me,
Yeah,
like, you have
yeah,
to have all four pillars. And I'm a bit of a spiritual gangster unicorn myself. And but you look at the scientific evidence, which, first off, monkey mind, talk about, like, do we always have to have objective evidence, or what happened to our divine intuitive wisdom,
uh,
and just our human intuition? But nonetheless, there is scientific evidence to point that having community is important for biological health. Having a sense of purpose increases
yeah,
longevity. Loneliness has been identified as its own predictive marker of all cause mortality. And so, yeah, we are experiencing the psychological burnout. And something that, just to kind of throw it out there, and something that I've started screening when I take on a new client, is orthorexic behavior, where we're so obsessed with, and this is part of my concern with functional medicine, is functional medicine is a very easy paradigm to sell. It's very easy to kind of make this claim of like, oh, here's all of your health complaints. Sure, we're just going to run a few tests. That's going to cost you a couple $1,000s. We'll identify the root cause. We treat that with supplements, and then poof, all of your concerns go away. And I think that can be misleading, because that's only one piece of it, but also this overwhelming sensation of orthorexia, where people are getting very obsessed and neurotic. I can't tell you how many clients I've had come to me where they were patients with some kind of big names in our industry, and like, oh, I was at the blah 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 clinic, and the protocol's not working, and I'm really freaking out and stressed out. I still feel awful. And my favorite question, why do you feel like you're not getting results? And kind of turn it back on them, and they just deer in the headlights. And I always kind of
Right.
gently, do you feel that you express any orthorexic behavior? Well, what's that? Well, basically, when you're stressing yourself out trying to be perfect with a diet or a protocol or whatever, and I think sometimes we can overcomplicate the physiology. And don't get me wrong, there's tough cases. There are tough cases. But nonetheless, a lot of times it's not, like 90% of the time, it's not that complicated. It's not that complex. And I find the spiritual piece and the psychological, the psycho-emotional, healing trauma,
Mm,
reprogramming our neuroplasticity.
mm.
So that's kind of something that I'm planning on steering more into in 2020 is, okay, yeah, I can talk about mold toxicity all day, but why don't we talk about, like, what's
Right,
your purpose? Do you
right,
have community? Do
right.
you ever slow down? So couldn't agree more. And I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And those patients I'm seeing as proximal bowel issue a lot oftentimes, which is really interesting. Like those patients were consistently obsessive and like they can't seem to find regulation. I'm finding that physiology. And so I work on both things. So I do something called NET. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I don't know.
It's one of my favorite emotional techniques in the world. It's called it's neuro emotional technique.
Okay.
It's phenomenal for like tracing to the root cause of when emotions started.
All
So
right. Yeah.
oftentimes with patients, I'll be like, let's see like why your plasticity is, why are your neurokinetics are programmed in this way also.
Hmm.
So, the body's amazing, right? Like we can sit here probably for 10 more days and
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
continue geeking out on all of these topics, right?
Totally.
And and it's incredible. I think, as patients, I think they just want to feel better, right? They're like, I just want
Okay.
to feel better. And I'm like, you're missing the journeying component of your own
Yeah.
healthcare,
Yeah.
which is an incredible teacher. For those who are sick, oftentimes I talk to ex-cancer patients and they're like, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me, you know?
Hmm.
Um, cause it was such a teacher for them,
Yeah.
you know? Not for everybody, but for those who take it on as a way to change their paradigms
Yes.
and make the things that are more important in their life. Um, it can be such a gift. It can be a very scary, very lonely navigating, right? Like we're a very pro health model. We hate, our culture doesn't take kindly to sick people.
No.
Um, and it's, and I'm always very empathetic with my patients, but it can be such a journey for truly rediscovering their spiritual component, their community,
Yeah.
their purpose here. Um, and in that way, though, so what you were saying is like the spirituality, the divine intuition, all that stuff is so prevalent. Like in this meditation retreat, such an I just keep going back to it is when I shut my brain off, the wisdom that comes out is so much more powerful and so much less stressful. And all of the little worries that we have consistently that our monkey mind is telling us all day, every day to grasp onto this and when we calm that down, like that's where the happiness emerges from.
Yeah.
The benefits of like a true meditative practice is phenomenal. So yeah, I'm curious what people take away from this talk, but I think this is why we both do what we do is because it uh, not only is like the science interesting, right? Like
Yeah.
it's super interesting of like what's going on with all these systems, and you do a deep dive and you go into the literature and you understand these components, and you can give these certain herbs and minerals and vitamins and sometimes pharmaceuticals, but most likely not, and then you can restore people and then also help them shift to a better state because as what we first talked about, the state of the world right now is a little bit scary.
It is.
And I think this is kind of a perfect circle of like when we tack into that spirituality, into the mindset. And, when I say spirituality, I just mean an inner calmness,
Yeah.
an inner state of kind of understanding rather than a reactionary state, right? Like when we have like an internal wisdom that we find that leads us forward in life. Um, that level of understanding is, if we can find that culturally, we're gonna bridge a lot of the negatives of what's happening right now. We're going to reverse a lot of the disease. But I think as much as it's a physiological problem, I think it's much a spiritual problem as well.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we have a lot of work to do as people. I think if we want to survive, I just saw this crazy documentary yesterday where they're giving Coca-Cola to babies in Mexico now. Like, and like same thing. It like breaks my heart to think about that. Like, Coca-Cola is literally being given to babies in these third world countries, and obesity and diabetes is becoming more rampant in these third world countries because Coca-Cola is cheaper than water. You know, like,
Yeah.
uh, like it's crazy. And I don't know what I want enough community coming together to change the systems at play.
Right.
So we just got to keep fighting, my friend.
I was gonna say that's why we're here. Yeah, this is amazing, kind of full circle convo, starting with kind of the state of the world, state of healthcare, diving deep into the root causes of disease, and then bringing it back to purpose and spirituality, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of unconditional love for self and others. And ultimately it always comes back to love. Love is the ultimate,
Right.
it's the highest frequency, it's the most healing emotion. And so the more that we can pursue love, unconditional love for self and others, raise the vibration of the collective, and
Right?
end on a little bit of a woo-woo note. But
Yeah.
I know you're here for it. So what an amazing convo. But
Yeah.
it's such an honor to be able to sit down with a good friend like you. And definitely next time we're at the same conference, which probably happen another 5 times this year,
Yeah.
hopefully be sure to grab dinner.
The holistic savage, my friends.
Yes.
The one and only. Such a pleasure to be on here. Thank you so much. Let's keep fighting the good fight. And yeah, looking forward. Maybe we'll do a hormone round or something in the future.
Oh yeah, there'll be around 2 for sure. Wonderful. Enjoy the rest of your day. Such
Thank
a
you so
pleasure.
much.
Can't wait to see you soon, my friend.
You too, my friend.
All right, see ya.
Okay. Bye-bye.